So you all actually really seem to enjoy the previous video that I did on starter decks, so I figured I'd dive in, do a few more, uh, go with some of the feedback I got from you guys on what starters I should do next. I mean, granted, after this video, I think there's only 3 more, so even if you want to suggest a starter I may have not gone over already, it'll more than likely be the next video where I go over more starters. But hey, everyone, Scar TV coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video, and today we're going to be diving back into the starter decks, talk about some upgrade paths you could possibly take when it comes to upgrading these starter decks to be a little bit more on the competitive side, kind of give you some perspective on my opinions of each of the starter decks, kind of give you my idea of how I would play the decks if I were to play them, and just overall kind of talk about each one in some manner. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're here, want to post new videos like this on the channel, hit that subscribe button. But let's dive into the decks and let's talk about it. This first deck up on the list is actually a fairly interesting deck. It's definitely hard for like a newer player maybe at first to kind of grasp the overall concept, but I mean, it is an interesting in a sense that it's one of those decks that's like it's enchantment slash artifact tribal. What it's trying to do here, we're playing a bunch of cards in the deck that kind of help out our enchantments and help us find enchantments, and we get then benefits up from playing enchantments. So I mean, like in early perspective, it's definitely hard to find paths to win, just because I would say this is a little bit on the slower side overall, since we're not really doing too much to really disrupt what our opponent's doing until we kind of get into that middle of the game. But overall, I do kind of like the idea of what they were trying to go for. It looks like it's inspiring a lot from the Ikoria set here, which is essentially, you know, was the introduction of enchantment creatures, where creatures are creatures and as well count as enchantments. So that's one benefit there. But I mean, overall, the deck from my plays when the decks were first released is like can definitely feel pretty clunky. Like I said, it kind of doesn't, if your opponent's super aggressive, it is definitely hard to kind of restabilize. Like there is no board wipes, there's nothing like that. There's just some spot removal and some stuff to hopefully slow down your opponent from maybe trying to kill you too early. But with that being said, like I said, there is some decent pieces in the deck that stand out to me of being super effective cards. First and foremost, the one card that I feel like makes pretty much any creature in this deck pretty aggressive and pretty strong is All That Glitters. I do like the idea here that you enchant a creature, and that enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. So I do like that idea that we can make a creature pretty big. The one thing is there's not in a lot of ways to kind of gain the life that we may lose in the early game, but there are ways that we can kind of hopefully slow down our opponent to kind of get to that point in the game where we may be able to kind of recapture control. And the next card is like the one card I would say that helps us with that life gain, and I think kind of brings the whole deck together because of all the enchantments we are playing, is actually Archon of Sun's Grace. The reason why I think this card's pretty good for this style of deck is just because it benefits from whenever we play enchantment spells, because it creates a 2/2 Pegasus token that can block, and as long as Archon Sun's Grace is still on the battlefield, all Pegasuses we control have lifelinks, so that's our very good way to kind of pop off and kind of regain some of that life back that we may have lost in the early game. But with that being said, also looking at the deck, I do think like the perspective of slow, there's not really a lot of ways for us to get, once we get something like Archon of Sun's Grace out on turn like 4, turn 5, to really take advantage of us starting to pump out some tokens. That's where I would actually think about looking into some enchantments and stuff that are on the cheaper side. I mean, like we do have the Eidolon of the Philosophy. It's a 1-mana 1/2 guy enchantment creature, and while it's okay for the perspective that yes, it's an enchantment, I just don't think the ability there for 7 mana is really worth it. I think there's better things in the 1-drop slot, maybe not in blue, but maybe in the white side that we could possibly use instead. I think the first one that comes to mind is All Seeds of Life's Bounty. It's a 1-mana enchantment that then will give any of our creatures protection from a particular color by sacrificing it, and it's also an enchantment creature. So in my upgraded version, you'll kind of see some of those cards that I think are better values for the slot that it's kind of doing. And like I said here, there's some stuff in the middle that I kind of feel like is okay, but I just don't think it makes the cut at the end of the day. The other thing too that I did that's actually pretty interesting in this is I actually brought in Yorion. If you don't know what Yorion is, I'll go over once I kind of go over that upgraded version deck. So the deck actually expands into an 80 card deck, which I do think is pretty interesting, like when it comes to the overall perspective. Now diving into the upgraded version of the deck, you can definitely see on how our pile has grown. Give me 1 second There we go. I'm a little bit smaller now, so because the pile is much wider, I think this is an overall better way so you can see all the cards in the list. And like in most videos, when I go over decks, I will have the deck list down below in the description. So if you want to copy it into the arena, I'll have a link to the deck list on Aetherhub that you can copy in. But with that being said, you can kind of see what I did here to kind of overall make the deck, I think, run a little bit smoother, kind of help us kind of stabilize in the early game where we are probably a little bit on the slower side. And I think the benefit of us having 80 cards, I think overall helps what we're trying to do. And you can see a lot of the cards in the deck are actually the ones that come in the starter deck. It's just that we increase some of the copies of the cards, and then we maybe added a couple that just weren't in. So kind of going into the 1-drop slot, we're only playing 4 copies of All Season Life Bounty, but I do think for the 1 mana, I do think it's pretty good cost and benefit getting out of it, because I mean, besides it being a 1 mana 1/1, it also has lifelink, and the sacrifice ability I think makes this card pretty good overall. Next thing we have is we actually up the copies of All That Glitters to 4 copies, just because we want to have some sort of aggression here, and I think having 4 copies in an 80 card deck is definitely a good way for us to hopefully draw it. Compared to some of the other cards, especially want to be a little bit more on the aggressive side, because our deck is slower. We kind of have to want to finish the game quickly just before our opponent maybe tries to get us if we're at a low life total. I added in some copies of Glass Casket. I think this is another good card for the deck. Overall, sure, it's not an enchantment, but I do like the idea that we can exile target creature for only 2 mana. That's converted at cost 3 or less. So I do think this is actually pretty good, and it counts towards the All That Glitters, artifact total. Then I added, I think we kept 3 copies of Brilliant Lettuce. I do think this is a good way to search our library for, basic land cards if we're not drawing the mana. We did increase the mana base overall. I think I am running something like 33 mana, if I'm not mistaken. So having a way to kind of, find them a little bit easier is definitely always a benefit. It's also on the cheaper end when it comes to the enchantment side. So having these in the deck is pretty good. Next card is Omen of the Sea. This is a 2-mana enchantment with flash, which means we can play it at instant speed, so we can do it at the end of our opponent's turn. And I like this card because it helps us kind of fix the top of our library and draw a card out of it, so we can kind of set up the top 2 cards if we like them both. We can kind of put the one that we want to draw first, which may be an answer, and then put the next one for the next turn, or if we do it at the end of our opponent's turn, we draw one and then draw it on our end step. Or on our draw step. And then we can also, in the later game, if we don't have any use for it, or we may have already used our Yorion and we haven't drawn in a while, we can always tap 3 mana, 2 colorless and a blue, and we can then scry 2, so it helps us to fix the top of our mana a little bit more. Then we have Banish and Light, which still makes the cut. I do think this is a good, decent balance when it comes to Glass Casket and Banish and Light. Keeping it on the enchantment side allows us to keep the enchantments on the battlefield, up in All That Glitters and other things that take advantage of enchantments on the battlefield. So definitely, combined with Archon of Sun's Grace, definitely a good way to kind of slow down our opponent's creatures and get rid of really pesky things, whether it's creatures and non-land permanents that we can target by Banish and Light. So definitely a pretty good card. We added in Omen of the Sun. I do think this is another good card that you can play at flash speed, so you can kind of catch your opponent off guard. Scry 2, just like the One of the Sea. And the benefit is we get 2 1/1 soldier tokens, which if your opponent tries to attack aggressively with possibly weak creatures, we can throw something in front of, and we kind of surprise our opponent by killing them in the process by playing our little 1/1 soldier tokens. If not, this is our way to kind of start building a board presence to kind of slow down our opponent if they may have other things on the board. Combine that with something like Midnight Clock. This is like another way for us to produce mana. If we get it to 12 counters, it's a decent way to shuffle our graveyard back into our deck, allowing us to kind of reset the game on our end and also draw a new 7 cards if we're kind of low on mana. It's just a very interesting card for a good long game. If you're playing against something like Rogues, this is definitely a good way to shuffle some things that may have gotten milled off the top of our library back into the deck if our opponent hasn't done anything to Midnight Clock. And it just tapping for additional mana is always good. And if we have open mana that we don't have any use for, we can always tap 3, and we can always put another counter on it quicker to kind of get it to 12 as quickly as possible. Thirst for Meaning, because it's an enchantment deck, might as well play it. It allows us to draw 3 cards, and we can discard 2 cards, or we discard an enchantment card to only discard 1 card. At instant speed for 3 is pretty good, like I said, in this style of deck. This kind of works with the synergy of just playing a lot of enchantments. Then we got Channeling Suit, which is kind of another interesting card here. Decent target possibly for an All That Glitters. Just on the basis of its power is equal to the number of artifacts and or enchantments we control. So if we do play it at 3 and we have nothing else on the battlefield, it's at least a 1/3. But if we play things on curve at a pretty good thing, it can come into the battlefield already as a 3/3, if not more, depending on when we get it. It does seem like a decent big body. Like I said, you can put something like an All That Glitters, it becomes even bigger. But overall, pretty good card in that manner. Yep, the copies of Arcana Sun's Grace. This is definitely something, like I said, for this style deck you want to draw, because this will help us finish out the game pretty quickly and help us gain a big chunk of life if our opponent doesn't have any sort of board removal. Because other than himself having lifelink and flying, we're going to create 2/2 Pegasuses every time. Pegasi? We're going to create multiple Pegasus. Single? Whatever. We're going to create multiple Pegasus, and those also have lifelink as long as the Archon's on the battlefield. And if we have something like All Seeds of Life Bounty, this will help protect us if our opponent tries to do a target removal spell on the card. So it's just definitely a good overall balance card to kind of keep our life total in check and allows us to kind of build up a little bit of an army to overwhelm our opponent in that manner. Follow it up, we actually added in one more copy of Luminous Broodmoth. I just think it kind of works for the deck. If anything that doesn't have flying dies, comes back into the battlefield with a flying counter on it. So that's definitely pretty good. I mean, some of our lower, there's not really a lot of things in the deck that doesn't have flying, but something like, Shambling Suit, we can get back. We can get something back like All Seeds of Life Bounty. So we can get back some of our early game stuff, which definitely, if we can get some replay out of it, is definitely very good. So getting back an All Seeds of Life Bounty after we sacrifice to give something protection is definitely a good effect. Also, this helps us in a sense if our opponent decided to board wipe. All the creatures that don't have flying that would die from the board wipe actually come back onto the battlefield unless it's an exile effect with a flying counter. So now they come back on the battlefield with a flying counter. So definitely a good way to kind of get around board removal in that manner. Then we also got Arcanist Owl. We upped the copies also. I think one more copy. I think there was only 2 and we upped it to 3. Just on the basis of it allows us to kind of dig in our library a little bit, look for an artifact or enchantment, add it to our hand, and put the rest on the bottom in any order. So essentially just allows us to kind of dig a little bit deeper, maybe find an answer. Maybe we need that draw spell. Maybe we need that Glass Casket, Banish and Light, or, something like, Omen, Elspeth Conqueror's Death, which is actually the next card. You just find the answer that you possibly could use by just digging that little bit more. Like I said, Elspeth Conqueror's Death is the next card. It is a decent saga in the sense that one, it exiles target permanent an opponent controls that has a converted mana cost 3 or greater. Definitely gets rid of those big pesky things that you definitely don't really have too much in the way of board removal. We're not really playing any board here, just because we kind of want to keep a lot of things out on the battlefield, especially if we're starting to go off with Archon. We want to keep our army out. We don't want to sacrifice our army to then whip the board in that process. It taxes our opponent on its second chapter, which makes all their non-creature spells cost 2 more to cast, which slows them down from possibly playing that board removal or big spell. And the third chapter is we get to return target creature or planeswalker back from the graveyard with a +1/+1 counter or loyalty counter on it. So we don't play any planeswalkers, but allows us to get back any of our creatures with a +1/+1 and or loyalty counter. Essentially, creatures get +1/+1 counter. So you can get something back like an Archon Sun's Grace. You can get back a Yorion that you may have played earlier in the game. You can get back, a Shambling Suit or something like that. You can get back a decent threat that once you bring it back, it kind of, makes our opponent, in an awkward position because they don't remove your graveyard. You're going to get back a decent creature and maybe get some decent value out of. Now going back into why I think Yorion's good here. So Yorion is a companion, which we have as in our companion slot, but we also have copies of it in our library. I did add 4 copies in because I do like the value. The reason why it's so good and why we would want to increase the amount of enchantments we have is that when he enters the battlefield, we get to exile any number of non-land permanents you control that we own and control and return those cards to the battlefield at the beginning of our next end step. So essentially what we would do here is if we have a bunch of enchantments, maybe you played a Glass Casket, or maybe you played something like a Banish and Light, Omen of the Sun, Omen of the Sea, you played something like an Arcanist Owl, all that stuff, Elspeth Conqueror's Death, anything that would stay on the board that we can flicker in a way, by essentially, exiling it for until our end step and bringing it back, which in turn then triggers its ability when it enters the battlefield again, which then we get double the value, so we can get back another exile target permanent that opponent controls 3 or greater. We can get, draw a card and also scry 2. We can get, some life and get some 1/1 tokens. We can, if there's another threat that we want to put a Banish and Light on, we can put a Banish and Light on something. If we had a creature that, we want to move all that glitters onto maybe something like an Arcana Sun's Grace, we can do that. The other thing here too is you can combine this and we remove all the enchantments back onto the battlefield. Also, if we attacked him with a Sun's Grace, we can actually flicker it off and then it comes back untapped, which is also pretty good. But then bring back all those other enchantments. Depending on how many enchantments we also moved to the battlefield and brought back with Yorion's ability, we'll get its constellation triggers for each one of those enchantments that come back onto the battlefield. So in return, you can essentially get 3, 4, 5 counters depending on how many enchantments that how deep into the game you are. So definitely good value there. And it's kind of tricky, but there is a little trick that you can do. You can put a stop or go full control when you play a Yorion if you already have one on the battlefield. And what happens, you get to choose, I think, the one that you play when it comes out on the battlefield. Correct me if I'm wrong. I've seen this been done. I haven't personally done it in that manner just because I was never able to pull off because of a lot of the creature hate that's currently in the meta as a whole. But you can then target the new Yorion you're playing, get that trigger, flicker this Yorion by being in full control because you can kind of stack the triggers and how they affect each other. Flicker this off, get the first Yorion effect, and then when it hits the end step, the second one comes back onto the battlefield, you get the next Yorion effect, and you get to almost double Yorion value. It sounds crazy. If you really want to see a demonstration of how it's done, I would just recommend watch a CGB video because he is like the Yorion king when it comes to Yorion. So I would definitely watch him if you're unsure what I'm talking about. He does do it a lot in a lot of his Yorion videos that he does play Yorion as a companion or in a deck. So I definitely say watch him or just watch someone who plays a lot more Yorion just because I don't play too much of it. I have the idea of how it works in my head. It's hard to really explain it in that manner. And then the last card is Kiora, the Best the Sea God. Essentially, it's just an overall pretty good saga. You get an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token with hexproof. Makes it hard for our opponent to remove, essentially, unless they have a board wipe or exile effect that exiles creatures of a certain mana cost. The second chapter is it taps down all our opponent's creatures until they don't untap during the opponent's next tap step, so your opponent takes a turn off, essentially. And the third chapter is you get to gain control target permanent and opponent controls, and you untap it. So essentially, whatever they have on the battlefield, on their side, you can take it. You can take a land, you can take an enchantment, you can take a creature, you can take an artifact. Whatever it is, you take it, and now it's yours until either they remove it or they just give up at that point. But overall, this is kind of like my upgraded version of the Starry-Eyed deck. I think it just works when it's a Yorion deck. I would just, I would mess around with it if you want to change some numbers around, if you want to add maybe something I removed. I just think some of the cards that I removed were just a little bit on the slower side. They just felt clunky. Sure, they seem good in the beginning when you're starting to get the grasp of the game, but I think once you start, playing the games, you kind of see what works and what doesn't. And in my personal opinion, those are cards that didn't. And I think these cards have better value in the end. And just quickly going over the mana base, it's 15 planes, 14 islands, 4 pathways, and then there's a couple mana producing things here with the midnight clocks. The other thing too is if you want, you can add in Fabled Passage if you're having issues with the mana. I just didn't want to add too many rares and things like that. That's why there's only so many of certain cards. I didn't want to go all in on them and then make it super expensive and make it harder to craft. But I do think this balance actually kind of works. Let me know what you guys think about this deck down in the comments below. But let's move on to another deck and let's talk about it. So this next deck is actually kind of interesting, and I kind of had an idea if I wanted to go with this when it came to upgrading, but I kind of wanted to kind of keep like what this was going on intact and not really deviate too much from it. But this is the Line of Fire deck. So essentially the overall perspective of this deck is that we're going to create a lot of things that we're just going to sacrifice to these creatures that have these abilities that trigger whenever we sacrifice another creature. Whether it's producing tokens or, drawing cards or, just trying to, do these particular effects to kind of, overwhelm our opponent in that manner. I mean, there's a handful of cards I can kind of look at that just, do some sort of sacrifice ability to get some sort of advantage. You got Direfleet Warmonger. It's a pirate. It's one of the very few pirates in standard at the moment. But at the beginning of combat, we can sacrifice another creature. If we do, it gains +2/+2 and trample to end of turn. So it can become a 5/5 on, turn 4, which is pretty good overall. The other thing too in the deck, we have something like this. It's a Gormand. It's like our big creature in the deck outside of Proxa. As flying trample, as additional cost to cast a spell, we sacrifice a creature, which we can always sacrifice a token that we just don't need. And then when it enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a creature. It's an okay ability for an uncommon. 5 mana for a flying trampler. 6 mana for a flying trampler. 5/5 that makes our opponent sacrifice a creature in the process of sacrificing, which is also pretty good. You got Croxa, which is probably the best card in the whole deck. Its ability is just super powerful. Enters the battlefield, we sacrifice it unless it was escaped, which escape is an ability when you exile the cards at the bottom, as you can see there, which is 5 mana. We pay the 4 mana, exile 5 cards from our graveyard. It comes back onto the battlefield. That's kind of the escape ability. The other reason why it's so good is when it enters the battlefield or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. So if they don't discard because you have no cards in hand, they lose 3 life. If they discard a land card, they lose 3 life. So definitely a good way to get damage in, regardless if your opponent has a blocker for it. But the idea here is you play for the 2 mana, you get the initial one on turn 2, and then in the later game, as your graveyard fills up, we get it back on turn, 5, 6, depending on how quickly it takes you to fill up your graveyard. The other idea here is we have a lot of things that make us sacrifice creatures, so there's definitely a lot of ways that we can get things back on the battlefield. The only thing I would say that's kind of the problem in the deck, there's a lot of things that, take advantage of us sacrificing, and there's a few things that have decent routes for us to make things on the battlefield to sacrifice to. But the problem is, I would say that's the one problem, is that there's not enough things that make tokens or things like that on the battlefield that we can just throw at something to then, give a +2/+2 effect, or, do 2 damage to a target creature or planeswalker, which, to be honest, I don't actually really like this ability. I think it's really expensive to just do 2 damage to something. I do think there's better removal. For 1 mana, you can play a Shock. Yeah, and you don't have to sacrifice anything, so that's something. Sure, you can exile an artifact, which I don't actually play, so I don't know. That one doesn't really work there. Tectonic Giant's pretty decent. Whenever attacks or becomes target of a spell and opponent controls, deals 3 damage to each opponent. Good way to ping them, regardless of doing damage. Exile top 2 cards of our library. We can choose one of them, play it until the end of our next turn. Play that card. Just kind of allows us to kind of dig a little bit deeper to play a card. But it doesn't really go well with our sacrifice ability. This takes advantage of, we draw X cards where X is the number of creatures that died this turn, under our control this turn, so we can flash it in whenever we may have a big amount of creatures that may have died. Draw, X amount of cards. Discordant Piper is one of the few ways that we can, get tokens, so we can sacrifice this, and then also sacrifice the goat token it produces. Bow Strider allows us to scry by sacrificing tokens. But like I said, there's a lot of things in the deck that kind of make it clunky, in the sense that we don't get enough things that produce tokens, because something like Slaughterhouse, Priest of the Magus, whenever we sacrifice a permanent, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Sacrifice another creature or enchantment, it gets first strike until end of turn. So definitely kind of decent combined with like these two, but to get that second ability there, it's definitely tough, just because you may not have enough creatures to sacrifice. Yeah, like I said, it's definitely an interesting deck. In the initial thing, I do think I made a few tweaks I think makes it overall better. Just because I feel like it's kind of trying to do the sacrifice thing, but it's not really focused on it. So we're kind of going to go into my version, and we're going to talk about what I did and what I upgraded. So the one thing you can probably already look at this deck and kind of see, it's definitely very confined now. It's not as, spread out. I do think I kind of just focused on some particular cards in the deck to kind of give it that little bit of an edge. I mean, overall, nothing really super changed. I just took out a couple cards, and I think I just kind of focused on, add in a few more cards to kind of make certain things work pretty well. Like I said, we kept 3 Dire Fleet Warmongers, we kept 2 of the Slaughter Priests, we kept 2 of the Aspirants. I think they're all pretty good. I do think each has their own benefit. I mean, this benefits from having both of them out. This one's pretty decent because it's on the cheaper side, and it has an ability to sacrifice a creature or an enchantment. So that's pretty good. The one thing I would say that I didn't kind of go over in the initial overlook of the deck is Village Rites is actually surprisingly really good for our deck. There was a part of me that wanted to play crap, I forgot what the name of the card was, but it's a 1 mana, gain control of target creature and opponent controls looking for it. It costs 3 or less. It costs 1 red mana. You can always play something like a Village Rites or something like one of these creatures that allows us to sacrifice. I may add that into it now thinking about it, just because I do think it works really, really well. I probably would get rid of something like Infuriate, just because I don't really think we need to pump a lot of things. I would say you probably want to maybe cut back on Infuriate, maybe cut back a copy of Fire Prophecy. I'll make the tweaks to the deck, but all right. So with the power of editing, I was able to kind of make the tweaks to the deck that I think actually kind of works, because we want to sacrifice our opponent's things, because why not take advantage of our opponent's creatures that they may be playing. So we added in a card called Claim the Firstborn. This is the card I was talking about. It allows us to gain control of target creature with a converted might cost 3 or less until end of turn. We untap that creature, it gains haste until end of turn. So what we can do here is, 1, we gain control of an opponent's creature that costs 3 or less. There's a lot of things in the meta as a whole that we can take control of. We're going to untap it, and then we're going to be able to attack in with it. Or we can actually sacrifice it in many of ways, to our Dire Fleet of Warmongers, to our Slaughter Priest of the Magus. It's Mogus, actually. It's not Magus. Blood Aspirant. Village Rites, we can always just, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards after we hit them in the face with their own creature. Definitely, Woe Strider, sacrifice a creature to scry. I do think this is a better shell. I think this card definitely fits really well in the idea of what we're trying to do here. Just being able to just kind of get rid of a thing an opponent owns is always good. I did actually cut down even more on Fire Prophecy and Careless Celebrant. I know it's definitely very tough. There's not a lot of ways of removal. Celebrant does 2 damage to target creature or planeswalker, which is a good way to get other spot removal, like small things. Fire Prophecy allows us to throw something on the bottom of our library, draw a card, and also do 3 damage to target creature. But it is very creature dependent, so if our opponent's not playing, creatures, it's definitely, useless in that manner. I added in 4 copies of Heartless Act, which I don't think were in the deck yet whatsoever. It's always good to, be able to have a spot removal for a bigger creature that maybe you can deal with. I increased the amount of copies of Kroxa because, this is definitely a good card. I didn't want to increase it too many, so I only own 2 copies, but I would definitely say this is something you may want to get a full set of at some point if you decide to play the Rakdos colors. Other than that, I mean, the deck is pretty straightforward. I think I added in some Call of the Death Dwellers because it allows us to get back a lot of these smaller things from our graveyard, so if we do end up sacrificing our own stuff, we can get back something like a Serrated Scorpion and one of our 2-drops. We can get back a 3-drop if we really wanted to and put a Menace and a Death counter on it, which is also pretty good. Increase the Woe Strider up to, additional copy. And then I just added in the Pathways. I do think Pathways are the way to go when it comes to the mana base. I do think if you want to craft lands out of any of the multicolors and you're playing a particular multicolor, I would definitely say craft the Pathways just because they're very flexible. They can be used in a lot of things. If you want to play this version of Rakdos or a different version of Rakdos, I would say the red and black mana is pretty good. And, all the Pathways are on the recent side post rotation from September. So these will be around for a good amount of time. So you'll probably get at least a year and a half of them before they rotate out. So, if you're looking for a dual land that comes in to play untapped, I would say these are definitely your way to go that way. But overall, I think at one point I was talking about a Kroxa strategy that is pretty interesting that this one has that's unique. Is that this one is a little bit clearer. So essentially what you want to do is you want to hold full control. You want to play Kroxa. You want to let it to come onto the battlefield and settle. So it'll initially be on the battlefield and it'll be triggering the ability to sacrifice it because it wasn't escaped. And what you can do here is you can then, trigger any of your abilities that would then sacrifice a creature. You can sacrifice the Kroxa before it sacrifices itself due to its ability and get its advantage. So if you sacrifice it, to the Slaughter Priest of the Mogus, you can, make Mogus gain strike. It's now also going to get +2/+0 into end of turn because it's going to gain the trigger from the sacrifice. Also sacrifice Kroxa to a Village Rites by, once it, playing it before the Kroxa then gets sacrificed, getting that ability. Even if it's leaving the battlefield, you'll get that ability. Fortunately, Dire Fleet Warmonger doesn't, synergize well. You can scry with the Woe Strider by sacrificing Kroxa. You can Blood Asper in here by tapping 2 and tapping him and sacrificing the creature and deal 1 damage to target creature, and that creature can't block. So definitely very interesting things here. Yet again, some of our sacrifice abilities are very static, so Blood Aspirant is also another card that benefits from us sacrificing Kroxa due to its ability. But like I said, I mean, the deck is focused around sacrificing things, and I do think this more combined, set of cards is much better. So I do think that I like my version more. I didn't want to go the full Rakdos strategy that you may see in a meta floating around there. That plays, various other things. But I do think this is, kind of a step up from starter deck in that manner. So this last deck here is the deck that you guys actually were asking for. And this is the Back from War starter deck. This is essentially the deck that has, like, a reanimate kind of synergy to it. So a lot of the cards that we are playing in the deck either come back from the graveyard or throw things in our graveyard to help us get things back from the graveyard. So, I mean, overall, the deck is pretty straightforward. It has a mixture of things that help us mill cards by milling 2 cards. This card also produces mana. Mire Triton throws things in the graveyard. We gain 2 life out of it. Demonic Embrace is a card that we can initially play for its 3 mana, but then we can play from our graveyard by paying 3 life in addition to its cost. We got Nightmare Shepherd, which we can actually whenever a non-token creature we control dies, we may exile it. If we do, we could a creature token of that, which is a nightmare into addition to its other types. So any of our creatures that may die here, we can exile them, make copies of them, get the trigger abilities of them again. This mills cards gets back permanent card back from our graveyard to our hands, which we can get back lands we may have milled or other creatures that we want to put back on the battlefield. Same thing that we mutate onto any of our non-human creatures, we get back a card from our graveyard. So a lot of this deck is what we're trying to do is just throw things in our graveyard and get it back in some sort of way by milling through it. Downfall is if our opponent's playing any sort of graveyard hate, it is definitely going to hurt us on a little bit there. But, you know, it's called Back for More as well because Back for More is a 6-mana return target creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. When you do, it fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. So not only is it a 6-mana fight spell, it's also a 6-mana let's reanimate something from our graveyard. There's decent things we can target here. I will say, in this current build, I would say you want to get something like a Tree Shaker Chimera back from the graveyard from the Back for More, just on the basis of, sure, its initial ability is pretty decent, but I do think the idea here is that you get to draw 3 cards if this dies, so reanimating it to possibly have it die if you're blocking something big and getting 3 cards out of it is definitely beneficial. But I do like the idea here. I do think, yet again, my version is a little bit more on the refined version. I do think I added a few other cards that may have not been out, or they were a little bit more on the expensive side and being like a mythic or something like that. So I didn't add too many more mythics in here, but I did kind of refine it and kind of get some things that I do think kind of work for the deck overall. So like I said, my version of the deck is a little bit on the more refined side. I did, you know, keep generally the most of the cards the same when it came to what was in the deck, but I just may have added a couple additional copies. So the couple of standouts here that I added that weren't in the deck already. One card being Fiend Artisan. The reason why I added this card into the deck is it benefits from us having creature cards in our graveyard in general. So we'll get +1/+1 each creature card in our graveyard. So us milling ourselves, essentially we'll pump this card up, making it very, very big. The other interesting thing here is it can technically eat one of our creatures by tapping X and a green or black mana, and we can sacrifice another creature. We can search our library for a creature card with a mana cost X or less, put onto the battlefield, and shuffle our library. Then we can shuffle. Then we can do this anytime we cast a sorcery. So pretty much on our turn and not during our combat step, we can actually sacrifice a creature, throw it in our graveyard, which would then pump him up, and then get back something that we may need to kind of put in our opponent's way, help deal with something our opponent's trying to do. I do think this is a pretty good card. I added more copies of Maya Triton. I do like Death Touch. I do like the idea here we're going to gain some life out of him. Or her, I guess. So definitely added more copies of that. Order of Midnight's on. I kept the same amount of copies. I do like the idea here that it is a card that we just return target creature card back from our graveyard to our hands. Definitely a good way to get back something there. Land of Aurora Visionary, I think, was 3 as it was already. We added in one more copy of Murderous Rider just because the destroy target creature ability is pretty good. And, 2/3 lifelink here that can get shuffled or put back on the bottom of our library when it dies is also really good. One more copy of Demonic Embrace because it can turn something like our little Fiend Artisan or something like our Prelucranos, make it into a big threat that our opponent now has to deal with in the air. Add in some more copies of Back for More because I want, this. I do like this ability. I do think there's certain things in our deck that we could definitely benefit from getting back, in the later game when we get to that 6 mana. If we want to get back, Fiend Artisan in the late game, we could have like 6, 7, 8 creatures in the graveyard and we get back a 9/9 that fights something, which is definitely very good. You can even get back a Maya Triton. Sure, it's not, probably going to live if it fights anything bigger than it, but it does have Death Touch, so it's definitely a good way to, just kind of kill something that it normally wouldn't if it didn't have Death Touch. I also threw on one Kogla. I do kind of like this card. I know it's a little bit on the pricier side, it being 3 solid green, but I do like the idea here that it enters the battlefield by itself and it actually fights something. So it's just another card that fights something. It's a 7/6 body, which is also pretty strong. Whenever it attacks, it destroys target artifact or enchantment defend player controls. So I think that's pretty good. And I think the other thing that is I did a split on Eliminates and Heartless Axe for our spot removal spells. And everything else, like I said, is pretty much the same when it comes to what was already in the deck. I just kind of, added a few more rares. I kind of refined, some of the cards, got rid of some of like the one-ofs and some of the cards I just didn't think really worked. It synergized very well with us trying to reanimate things back from the graveyard. I kind of just focus on those cards. And, I added Pathways in. So, I mean, that is the Back for More upgraded. Like I said, I'll have all these deck lists down in the description below if you guys want to check out these decks, import them, make tweaks that you think will work for the deck. Let me know what you guys think of these decks overall as a whole. If you're new here, like the videos, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you want to know when I post videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next Magic the Gathering video.